The most famous plot twist in movie history was never actually filmed. The man in the Darth Vader suit spoke a completely different line on the day. A lie fed to him deliberately, and almost nobody on that set had any idea what they were really making. Only three people in the world knew the truth. This is The Empire Strikes Back, the 1980 sequel directed by Irvin Kershner, starring Mark Hamill, Harrison Ford, and Carrie Fisher, and financed by George Lucas out of his own pocket. It nearly bankrupted him. Today we count down 20 weird facts about it and stick around for number one because Lucas came within a whisker of losing everything. Subscribe and comment your favorite Star Wars film. Let's get into it. The revelation that Darth Vader is Luke's father is arguably the most guarded secret in cinema history, and the way the production protected it was extraordinary. On the day the scene was shot, the line was not performed at all. David Prowse, the bodybuilder physically inside the Vader suit, was given entirely different dialogue, saying instead that Obi-Wan Kenobi had killed Luke's father. That was the version everyone on that soundstage heard and believed. By Mark Hamill's own account, only three people in the world knew the truth: Hamill himself, director Irvin Kershner, and George Lucas. Kershner reportedly came to Hamill's dressing room, told him he was about to be trusted with something, handed him a piece of paper with the real line on it, and warned him plainly that if it leaked, they would know exactly who to blame. The genuine line was dubbed in later by James Earl Jones. Hamill kept the secret for around a year and a half, and the rest of the cast, including Harrison Ford, only learned the truth watching the finished film. The deception was arguably a little cruel to David Prowse. The former British weightlifting champion physically embodied Vader across the original trilogy, providing the towering presence and menace, yet his voice was always replaced by James Earl Jones in post-production. And here he was actively fed false dialogue so he could not leak the twist even accidentally. The man inside the most famous villain costume in cinema history spent the shoot performing a scene whose actual meaning had been deliberately withheld from him, and found out what he had really been part of at the same time as the paying audience. The secrecy around the twist was not simply a matter of limiting the information to essential personnel. It involved a very specific and rather funny judgment about one particular cast member. Mark Hamill has been openly, affectionately blunt about why Carrie Fisher was never let in on it. In his words, she had no vault whatsoever. Hamill has described how he and Harrison Ford used to actively test this quality in Fisher. If either of them wanted a piece of information to travel quickly around the production, the most efficient method available was simply to tell Carrie Fisher in strict confidence, and out it would go. Given that, telling her the biggest secret in movie history was never seriously on the table. The payoff came at the premiere when the whole cast watched the revelation land for the first time. Hamill has recalled Ford turning to him in the dark and demanding to know why he had not been told, using considerably stronger language. The exchange in the carbon freezing chamber, where Leia tells Han she loves him and he simply answers that he knows, is one of the most beloved moments in the entire saga. It was not what George Lucas wrote. The script called for a conventional response, with Han replying that he loved her too. Irvin Kershner shot the scripted version and found it wrong. He tried take after take and nothing satisfied him, because the line simply did not sound like Han Solo. Eventually, Kershner told Harrison Ford to stop thinking about it entirely and just play the moment, and Ford dropped in the two-word reply on instinct. Kershner called cut immediately and said, "That was the line, that was Han Solo." Ford himself has explained his reasoning bluntly, that a scripted declaration of love was a lost opportunity and that you want your tough characters to stay tough. Lucas preferred his original line and pushed back, but after test screenings showed audiences adored Ford's version, he relented. Kershner later described this as the only sharp disagreement he had with Lucas across the entire production, which is remarkable given how much else went wrong on the film. It is also perhaps the clearest illustration of why hiring Kershner worked. A director purely serving the script would have shot the scripted line and moved on. Kershner kept pushing because something in the moment felt untrue to the character, and the result is a two-word reply that fans have been quoting for more than 4 decades, arguably the most beloved piece of dialogue Harrison Ford ever improvised. The first draft of The Empire Strikes Back was written by Lee Brackett, a genuinely legendary figure in American storytelling. She was a celebrated science fiction novelist, sometimes called the Queen of Space Opera, and a formidable Hollywood screenwriter who had written for Howard Hawks on classics including The Big Sleep and Rio Bravo. Lucas hired her specifically for that pedigree. Brackett delivered her draft and then, tragically, died of cancer in early 1978 before Lucas had even had the chance to sit down and give her his notes on it. Her version differed substantially from the finished film, and Lucas ended up writing the next draft himself before bringing in a young, then unproven writer named Lawrence Kasdan, for whom Empire became his first released feature. Lucas insisted on preserving Brackett's screenplay credit anyway, and reportedly paid her family additional money beyond what her contract required. Her name remains on one of the most acclaimed screenplays ever produced, for a version of the story that largely did not survive. Here is a wonderful collision between two of the most celebrated films of the era. In January 24th, 1979, while the Empire team was waiting to move into Stage 3 at Elstree Studios in England, that stage was still occupied by Stanley Kubrick, who was shooting The Shining there. On the night of the 24th, Stage 3 burned down in a flash fire, reportedly possibly caused by a discarded cigarette, and the cluttered driveways of the studio prevented fire trucks from reaching it in time. By morning, it was a ruin. The consequences rippled directly into Star Wars. Because the Empire production had been queuing up to take over that stage, its destruction forced a complete rescheduling of the film. Worse, Kubrick now had to rebuild his own set on a different stage, which effectively denied the Empire team 2 stages rather than 1. There is an even stranger footnote to their coexistence. Some of the artificial snow created for The Shining was reportedly reused on Empire to help build the frozen surface of the planet Hoth. The irony runs deeper still. Both films were shooting frozen landscapes at the same studio at the same time, and both were doing it in punishing heat. Kirshner has recalled that temperatures inside the Elstree sound stages reached around 100 degrees while his crew worked amid fake snow coated with salt to make it glitter convincingly on camera. Two of the most acclaimed films of the era, a horror masterpiece about a snowbound hotel and a space opera about an ice planet, were built side by side in the same sweltering English studio, sharing snow and stealing each other's stages. For the ice planet Hoth, the production traveled to Finns, a remote mountain village in Norway, to shoot on a real glacier. They arrived directly into a catastrophe. The region was struck by the worst winter storm it had seen in roughly half a century, with the weather reportedly clearing for only about 2 days across the entire shoot. Conditions became genuinely dangerous. Avalanches shut down the railway line, cutting off the roughly 70 technicians and actors based there from the outside world for days. An Arctic survival camp built to house the crew at the glacier's summit was simply buried. The team endured whiteouts so severe that blizzards whipped the snow into blinding powder. The production solution to shooting in this chaos became legendary for its simplicity. For several shots of Luke struggling through the frozen waste, they reportedly just opened the door of the crew's hotel, pointed the camera out into the car park, and sent the actors staggering into the real blizzard. The design of Yoda is one of the great achievements in creature effects, and the face that convinced audiences a rubber puppet could be a living, wise old master came from a very personal source. Stuart Freeborn, the veteran makeup artist who built him, reportedly used his own face as the fundamental model for the Jedi Master, meaning Yoda's underlying features belonged to the man who made him. He then added a crucial second ingredient. To convey the sense of profound, otherworldly intelligence the character required, Freeborn incorporated the distinctive deep wrinkles of Albert Einstein into the design, borrowing the face of the 20th century's most famous genius to sell Yoda's ancient wisdom. The combination worked so completely that audiences accepted a 2-foot puppet as one of the most beloved characters in film history. George Lucas was so impressed by Frank Oz's performance that he mounted a campaign to have Oz nominated for an Academy Award, which failed on the grounds that Oz was considered a puppeteer rather than an actor. The character took a long and slightly ridiculous road to becoming Yoda. In early drafts, he went by other names entirely, appearing at various points as Minch Yoda, and simply as a critter, and at one bizarre stage, he was reportedly called Buffy. He was also originally conceived as a considerably larger and slimier creature before the design shrank into the small, ancient, dignified figure audiences met on screen. The most quoted Jedi in the franchise spent his development as a big slimy monster with a placeholder name that would later belong to a teenage vampire slayer. Filming the Dagobah sequences was genuinely miserable for Mark Hamill, and the practical setup explains why. The entire swamp set was constructed roughly 5 feet above the studio floor so that puppeteers could crawl underneath and operate Yoda from below. That meant Frank Oz was performing the role from beneath the stage, physically unable to hear the crew or the actors above him, while Hamill was up top acting opposite a puppet. The production attempted a technological fix that failed comically. They tried feeding Oz's dialogue to Hamill through a radio earpiece, but commercial radio signals kept bleeding into the frequency. Hamill has recounted that if he turned his head the wrong way, he would suddenly pick up a music station in the middle of his Jedi training, hearing the Rolling Stones instead of Yoda. The experiment was abandoned. Hamill has spoken about how isolating those months were, working as essentially the only human being on set, acting his most emotionally demanding scenes into thin air. There is another Hamill detail worth knowing about this film. In 1977, between the two pictures, the actor was involved in a serious car accident that left him with a broken nose and cheekbone. When Lucas was developing Empire, he reportedly considered building an in-story explanation for any change in Luke's appearance, which is one account of why the film opens with Luke being savaged by a wampa and left with a scarred, battered face. Hamill has since pushed back firmly on the persistent rumor that he required extensive plastic surgery, but the wampa attack remains one of the more elegant pieces of problem solving in the saga. The Imperial walkers advancing across Hoth are among the most iconic images in the entire saga, and their unforgettable lumbering gait was a product of genuine zoological homework. The effects team at Industrial Light and Magic, led by animators including Phil Tippett and John Berg, needed the enormous machines to move with convincing, heavy, real-world weight rather than looking like toys. Their solution was to go and find the closest available equivalent. Tippett has described how the team traveled out to a wild animal farm, secured access to an elephant, and put chalk marks on all of the animal's joints so they could film and study exactly how a genuinely massive four-legged creature shifts its bulk when it walks. That study informed the stop-motion animation of the walkers, frame by painstaking frame. The original AT-AT designs, incidentally, were nothing like the finished machines, having reportedly started life as big armored vehicles with wheels. The rest of the Hoth battle was built with equally punishing craft. Because no suitable real location could deliver the shots, an artist was hired to paint the frozen landscapes, and the walkers were animated in stop motion directly in front of those painted backgrounds. The animators worked long, tedious hours popping up through trapdoors in the miniature set to adjust the models one frame at a time, surrounded by fake snow made from baking soda and tiny glass bubbles. Every ponderous step those machines take represents hours of somebody crouching under a table, moving a model a fraction of an inch. The Millennium Falcon's flight through the asteroid field is a dazzling technical showcase, achieved with hundreds of physical models filmed against black backgrounds and composited together. Creating that many convincingly irregular chunks of tumbling rock was an enormous practical challenge, and ILM's solution was gloriously low-tech. Alongside the properly sculpted asteroid models built from materials like plaster and rubber, the effects team simply reached for whatever oddly shaped objects were lying around. Potatoes were reportedly used as smaller asteroids, their lumpy, irregular surfaces reading perfectly as rock once painted and shot in isolation against black. And according to production lore, at least one of the objects hurtling past the Falcon in that sequence is a shoe. One of the most thrilling sequences in science fiction cinema was built partly out of root vegetables and footwear, and audiences have never once noticed. We are halfway through the Empire, and the 10 strangest facts are still ahead, including the loan that nearly ruined George Lucas. If you are enjoying this, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe. And drop a comment telling me the single greatest moment in the whole saga. Alright, back to Hoth. One of the film's most memorable and slightly stomach-turning moments comes when Han Solo, finding Luke freezing to death in the snow, cuts open the belly of his dead Tauntaun and pushes Luke inside the warm carcass to keep him alive through the night. It reads as pure invented alien wilderness lore, but the tactic reportedly comes from genuine survival practice. The idea traces back to accounts of hunters and survivors using the body heat and insulation of a freshly killed large animal as emergency shelter against lethal cold. A real technique for staying alive in a sudden blizzard. Lucas adapted that grim practical wisdom into a science fiction setting. There is a nice piece of trivia buried inside the scene, too. To perform the cut, Han borrows Luke's lightsaber, which makes him the only character in the entire original trilogy who is not a Jedi to actually wield one on screen. The financial history of The Empire Strikes Back is genuinely alarming. Reports of the earliest projections vary, with some placing the initial budget as low as $8 million and the figure Lucas was working toward around $18 million. What is not in dispute is where it ended up. By the time the film was finished, the cost had climbed to somewhere around $30.5 to $33 million. The overruns had numerous causes, all of them compounding. The Elstree fire forced rescheduling. The Norwegian blizzard destroyed the location plan. The production built more than 60 separate sets, reportedly more than double the number used on the original Star Wars. Injuries and illness disrupted the schedule further. Lucas has laid part of the blame on producer Gary Kurtz being unable to say no to his director, as Kershner pursued the richer, deeper film he wanted to make. The result was one of the most expensive films of its era, and Lucas was personally on the hook for it. Before Irvin Kershner was hired, Lucas considered other directors, and one meeting has become a small legend. The Dutch filmmaker Paul Verhoeven, later famous for RoboCop, Total Recall, and Basic Instinct, took a meeting with Lucas and producer Gary Kurtz about the possibility of directing the Star Wars sequel. By Verhoeven's own account, he arrived and screened them a cut of his new film, a Dutch picture called Spetters, which he has described as essentially a far more explicit version of Grease. It is a raw, provocative, sexually frank film, and it is difficult to imagine a less suitable audition piece for the family-friendly space fantasy Lucas was preparing to make. Verhoeven has said that after that screening, he simply never heard from them again. Lucas turned instead to Irvin Kershner, who had been his film professor at university and whom Lucas regarded as a mentor. The choice of Irvin Kershner to direct the most anticipated sequel in history baffled many observers at the time. Kershner had never made a science fiction film, and his background was in smaller, character-driven dramas. That was precisely the point. According to production notes from the era, Kershner was selected specifically for his insights into human relationships rather than any technical credentials with effects or spectacle. Lucas understood that the sequel needed emotional depth that the first film, for all its brilliance, had not attempted. Kershner has said that when he accepted the assignment, he knew immediately that it had to be a dark film with far more character depth than its predecessor, and that he wanted to make a fairy tale rather than a comic book. The gamble is why Empire endures. It is the entry where the romance aches, the mentor is disappointed, the hero fails, and everything ends in loss, and that came from hiring a director who cared about people rather than starships. Given that The Empire Strikes Back now sits near the top of virtually every list of the greatest sequels ever made, it is genuinely startling to learn that its initial reception was mixed. A significant number of contemporary critics were not won over. The film's darkness, its refusal to resolve, and its unhappy ending struck some reviewers as a disappointment after the pure adventure high of the original. Some critics complained that the film simply stopped rather than concluded, leaving a hero maimed and defeated, a friend frozen and carried off, and the villains triumphant. In an era before audiences were accustomed to serialized storytelling in blockbusters, that lack of resolution felt to some like a commercial cheat rather than a bold artistic choice. Kershner himself later observed that it took a few years for critics to catch up with the film and to appreciate it as the fairy tale he had intended. The reputation it enjoys today was earned slowly, over decades. Audiences, notably, did not share the hesitation. The film was the highest grossing release of 1980 and went on to earn somewhere in the region of $400 million worldwide on its initial run, with later re-releases pushing the lifetime total far higher. The gap between the lukewarm critical response and the overwhelming public embrace is a useful reminder that the consensus around a film is not fixed at release. The Empire Strikes Back is now so widely regarded as the peak of the saga that its cautious 1980 reviews read almost as a historical curiosity. For all the stories of Lucas's control and the difficulties of the production, one detail stands genuinely apart from Hollywood norms. Having financed the film himself and taken on enormous personal risk, Lucas recovered his entire investment remarkably quickly, with the film reportedly earning back its whole cost within about 3 months of release. Rather than simply keeping the windfall, Lucas shared it. He distributed bonuses to his employees, reportedly totaling in the region of $5 million, an act of profit sharing well outside standard industry practice at the time, when the people who actually built a blockbuster typically saw nothing beyond their wages. It is worth remembering alongside the more famous stories of studio warfare and creative disputes. The man who had just risked personal bankruptcy to keep control of his own film turned around and cut his crew in on the reward. The reason Lucas was gambling his own fortune at all comes down to a decision he made about ownership. Having endured a brutal, exhausting experience making the first Star Wars, one that left him hospitalized with stress and exhaustion, Lucas was determined not to hand creative control of the sequel to a studio. 20th Century Fox would distribute the film, but Lucas resolved to finance it independently through his own Lucasfilm. That meant funding a monstrously expensive production out of his personal profits from Star Wars plus borrowed money. It was an enormous risk, taken specifically to avoid sharing creative rights, and it is the reason the finished film feels so uncompromised, so willing to end on defeat and ambiguity. No studio executive had the authority to demand a happier ending. The independence that produced one of the greatest sequels ever made also meant that when the money ran out, there was nobody standing behind Lucas but Lucas. And the money did run out. As costs spiraled, the Bank of America, which had been backing the production, reportedly called a halt to its financing. This was not a minor cash flow inconvenience. The production still had wages to pay, and its principal lender had stopped the flow of money on the most anticipated film in the world. What followed was a scramble for survival. Lucasfilm's president went to another institution, the First National Bank of Boston, to buy out the existing debt, reportedly seeking around $25 million to keep the picture alive. Lucas personally guaranteed it, promising in effect that he would repay the money out of his own pocket, even if it took him the rest of his life. Even that was not enough on its own. To secure the loan, Lucas reportedly had to make a humiliating trip back to Fox to ask the very studio he had worked so hard to keep at arm's length to act as guarantor. Amid all the stories of blizzards, fires, and financial chaos, the production also suffered a genuine human tragedy that is rarely mentioned. John Barry, the acclaimed British production designer who had won an Academy Award for his work on the original Star Wars, was working on Empire as a second unit director. By accounts of the production, Barry reported to work complaining of a headache and died within hours from what was described as an isolated case of meningitis. He was 43 years old. It was a sudden, shocking loss of a hugely talented figure who had helped define the entire visual language of the Star Wars universe. And it happened in the middle of an already punishing shoot. The film's reputation rests heavily on how it looks and feels, on the lived in texture of its worlds, and a substantial part of that achievement belongs to a man who did not live to see the finished picture. Everything above converges on this. George Lucas had, in Star Wars, produced one of the most profitable films ever made, and he chose to take that fortune and place essentially all of it on a single sequel that he financed himself in order to keep control of his own creation. When the budget quadrupled, when the banks pulled out, when he was personally guaranteeing loans in the tens of millions, the danger was not merely that a film might underperform. Lucas was risking the loss of Lucasfilm itself and the entire Star Wars property with it. Had Empire stumbled at the box office, the man who had just given the world its most valuable modern myth could plausibly have lost ownership of it. And the entire subsequent history of the franchise, the sequels, the merchandising empire, and eventually the multi-billion-dollar sale to Disney would have belonged to somebody else. Instead, the film earned back its full cost in around 3 months and went on to gross hundreds of millions worldwide. The greatest sequel ever made was also one of the largest personal bets in the history of the movie business, and it paid off by a margin that still looks terrifying in hindsight. So there you have it. 20 weird facts about a sequel financed by one man's personal fortune, nearly destroyed by a blizzard, a fire on Kubrick's set, and a bank that walked away mid-shoot. Its greatest line was a lie told to its own cast. Its second greatest was improvised on the spot. Its asteroids were potatoes, and its Jedi Master wears Albert Einstein's wrinkles. Critics were lukewarm in 1980, and now it is routinely called the finest sequel ever made. Not bad for a film that ends with the heroes losing.